Hi, I'm Unthank, founder of Etumos. Today we're going to be talking about the 5 program templates that you need to scale your digital marketing efforts. These are meant to encapsulate about 90% of what you actually do in marketing, and these are the programs that we've assembled to make that much faster. The things that we're going to be focusing on are how you can communicate to your prospects more effectively, how you can track your marketing campaign success, and how you can make sure that you're doing this minimizing errors overall. This session is meant to cover off on, as I say, the 5 fundamental program templates. These are going to be content, emails, list import, webinar, and event. On this video, we set it up so that you can skip around to whichever template you're actually focusing out on building. And within each of those templates, we're going to be talking about a few different sections. Those include the setup, the tokens, the assets that you need, and the most impactful parts of each of those templates so that you can focus on what actually matters and not on a thank you subject line. So let's get into Marketo and start with the first template, which is the content program template. So I wanted to talk through specifically some pieces of how we work with landing pages and thank you pages and emails, specifically talking about our token framework. So on screen here, we have what our landing page is. So you can see on the right version here, this is what the actual rendered version of the landing page is. And kind of the process that we go through in the process of tokenizing is to look at each of these individual pages. If you're talking about landing page, thank you page, or emails, any of the specific types, we take it and we try to look at it in terms of what the major sections are. The point of this is that we can do kind of create our own miniature CMS. So you can see on the right, this is what the actual content does. This is kind of our lorem ipsum placeholder text. And then the left version is kind of a redlined version of what the tokens are that actually drive the content on the final page. So when we actually go into the content editor and we actually change the content on these pages, we actually don't go into the editor at all. We don't go into the WYSIWYG editor. Usually what we end up doing is we're working through the tokens. We have this specific image in front of us as we're writing up the copy. And then we go through and we define the content LP CTA text and the image and the headline. And we kind of have little miniature descriptions of what each of these sections does. And so kind of through the process of doing this for a bunch of different Marketo instances, we found that regardless of design, there are really common design elements from one to the next. And throughout the process, we saw, we're dealing with headline, super headline, sub headline, text, image, form title, form CTA text, form button, kind of a standard package. And this is what we've come up with. So here on screen, you can see an example of what some of a small piece of our token framework is. This is a screenshot version. I'll jump into demo in an actual second here. But just wanted to give you an idea of the final version. Even if in our editor, it looks like the version on the left without the yellow boxes, even though it looks kind of broken in the editor version, the final approved page looks like this on the right, which is fully responsive, best practices design, and trying to simplify things so you don't have to worry about every single element every single time that you do this. So to get a little bit more specific here, kind of through the process, we've done content programs for a lot of different companies. We've done, basically we've found that there are these consistent pieces that you end up doing, such as, headline, text. They're the similar elements from each and every piece. So in a content program, you have a landing page, you have a thank you page, and you have a fulfillment email, are the kind of the pieces that are prospect facing. And kind of through the process, we saw that from these things, there's some pieces that you really do have to change on a specific asset basis, or every new piece of content you need to change things. And there are other things that you should do more and address more in a once per year, once per half year kind of cadence. There are things that are more, you do them up front when you're designing the template. You kind of look at, see what are the things that we actually need to change every single new piece of content that we make. And there are other things that don't really affect that, the overall conversion rate on a landing page. So throughout the next few slides, I'm going to show you basically what we found from doing this a bunch in a bunch of different marketing organizations of what are the actual things that are going to influence results and what aren't. And this is what we have on the landing page. So this is a kind of zoomed out version on the right and the left here of what the final landing page looks like. This is what we've done and kind of A/B tested a bunch, and found that this is a pretty consistent, 7% conversion rates on a landing page is these kind of design elements. So that's the real version on the right here. On the left, I've taken it and kind of annotated by the red boxes with the lines through them. These are the things that we don't change on it's per content basis. So these are the things that we look at, we affect them, and we actually change them once when we're making the template, but we don't actually go through and change every single time. So examples are the CTA text on the top right. This is a header element. Basically, if you click on this, it's just an anchor link and it jumps down to the form. It's meant to be used on mobile and iPads when this looks like much more long content than you'd be, maybe willing to scroll through. But things like the CTA text there, or the actual button color, those are things that you shouldn't change on a per content basis, and you shouldn't be layering those out so that your marketing managers expect to have to change them or expect to write copy for those specific things. And so if you just look through here, so we have the super headline, marketing technology resources. This is something, it's a small filler piece of background information, doesn't have any impact on actual conversion rate if it says marketing technology resources or marketing resources or marketing downloads or anything else like that, or white paper. It doesn't really have any effect on the overall conversion rate on this page. Other things we found don't have any effect end up being the footer, obviously, and the form headline is, we find it really makes sense to change this when you're talking about use case things. So for example, in content, for the most part, when we're talking about responsive landing pages, guides, white papers, other things like that, we found that this kind of title, if you standardize on it once, it shouldn't really be changed every single time. And the other thing we found is we use global, or rather universal forms. We have something like 10 different versions of forms, and we use them consistently. So things like a content download, universal content download, universal event registration, universal hand raise form. Those are 3 examples that we use quite a bit. In this case, we have universal content download. And this is, if you have one universal form, the really benefit that you get from that is that you can do testing on that specific form. And you can do things like progressive profiling with this form. So for example, on this specific, you can see we have a full name field. This is a custom field, and then on the back end, after somebody fills this out, we're kind of a combination of 2 things. So we have a piece of JavaScript written on that full name field that takes and divides that into first name and last name, which are actually hidden fields on this form. And then the other thing that we do is on the back end, we have a little smart campaign with a webhook that takes somebody's full name, divides it into first name and last name. The other thing that we've seen is you can have progressive profiling in here. And that's kind of, if you have it in one place, it's really manageable to edit. If you have a form in every single content piece, it's really unmanageable to edit, with the small exception case of if you're not using native Marketo landing pages, and we use forms for every single piece. But highlighted in green here, most important, is these are the things that we expect a marketing manager to actually come up with new versions for every single piece of content. So the idea is, if we look at this landing page, if you change these 3 things from marketing manager, we say if you change the image, the headline, and then the description text, the actual body text, these are the 3 things that change and make this an entirely new asset. And you can imagine, like, this significantly decreases the amount of work that you need to do. Marketing manager, it lowers the bar the marketing manager needs to write things, and it lowers the amount of work that you need to do to change everything every single time. And we've found, especially, the range of who wants to do an amount of customization depends on how mature and busy really your marketing teams are. So the super scaled version is that we have marketing managers just change these 3 things for the landing page. Versus if you have a bunch of time and want to really eke out very small results, you can get into arguments about, should it say, we'll email it to you, or should it say, fill out the form and we'll give it to you right now? In my opinion, and through testing, we've basically found that there's no practical difference in conversion rate from those 2 options. And so therefore, it's not really worth arguing about or spending any time with. To jump into the next one here, we have a thank you page. So this is the same thing. I want to walk you through some things that we found are really useful elements overall in this, and which ones aren't. So here on the right version, you see this is the zoomed out version of the thank you page. Generally, we have a headline here. It says generic thing like, thanks, here's the download for you. We keep it generic so that we don't have to spend time tweaking that specific headline. And the other thing that we do is we have a download it now button. So these three elements on the top, we generally don't change those every single time, because we found that it has no effect on actually who clicks that button or who continues to actually download further. But through the process, we've also tried to test some other things. So really what I find thank you pages valuable for is this section down here. You have someone who just gave you their information, they just filled out a form, they just asked for a content recommendation, they already have confidence in you as a company enough that they trust what you're doing. So I think the most valuable piece of a thank you page is, out of all of these elements, this secondary call to action here that's highlighted. So in terms of things that we actually change on a per content basis, on a not actually, not talking about the design things, is we change this middle highlighted additional CTA. And that's why it's here in green. Everything else, you can see, generally what we do is, for design aesthetics, I find it fine to have a 3-row here, or rather 3 columns. We have blog, which is generic, it never changes. We have this individual piece in the middle, and this changes, sometimes every time, sometimes per content, sometimes it's whatever your offer of the month is, kind of thing. And then the premium resources is a static thing that never changes. In a really evolved version of this world, you can use a tool to actually make this kind of a recommendation engine to compute what this individual secondary call to action should be. So for example, a few years ago, I had given a presentation on how to make a recommendation engine within Marketo. Quite complex, but it is possible. You can also do really more simplified things, such as having segmentations and then dynamic. This is just a piece of dynamic content right in here. That allows you some dynamism, but you're not going crazy over eking out small increases in conversion rates there. The idea in an ideal world, and how I consider best practices overall, but probably not worth most companies trying to get there immediately, is to have someone to be able to chain through and mass consume all of your pieces of content just through the process of filling out a form, clicking download it now, coming to the thank you page, seeing that this link changes, being intrigued by that, click get it for free, and then goes to another landing page, and it chains on through it so that they can consume the entirety of your content. That allows people to go at their own pace, and so you're not waiting for people, once a week we'll email you with you should download the next thing. But kind of in testing these things, we found that the top section here, thanks for downloading, download it down to download it now, doesn't really have much of an effect on conversion rate at all. We've tried this specific element, the social share. I actually have mixed opinions about how effective this is. So for us specifically, when we have low volume, we're doing this for demo purposes mostly. I think this can actually net hurt you when you come to this thank you page and see that nobody has shared a single thing on any asset, on any resource. So I think this works for high volume things, especially if you have social efforts where you can get past the original threshold of 0. If you post this specific article 3 times on each social network, then you have numbers that actually makes this look like it's a legitimate thing. But I think if these will be 0 forever, that can net hurt in branding kind of effect. That's just my opinion. So when we do this for other clients, and basically any time passes, we don't include this social share piece here. But we do include this large section, which is the 3 column, static CTA for the blog, and then dynamic CTA in the middle, which is asset specific, and then finally a resources page. To jump into, so basically the flow goes, somebody goes to the landing page, fills out this form, it takes them to the thank you page. From the thank you page, or rather from filling out the form, we email them this specific email. This is FE stands for fulfillment email. This is really meant to be as templatized as possible. So you can see here on the right, this is a version. We send it from, for example, lead owner. That's pretty static. We don't change that ever. You should never have a marketing manager say, I want this to come from the CEO this time is a bad use of your political marketing capital. So we keep the from the same. The subject is super tokenized. You can see it's basically your request and then the asset title. This changes, on more of the operational level as opposed to being directional from the marketing managers. We see this preview line quite beneficial on a template level. On an individual, talking about the conversion rate from getting this email into clicking the download button, not much of an effect at all. So we keep this static. That's why it's red over here. Here you go. The actual title is, again, didn't see much conversion rate increase. Hi, Edward. So we do first name here. You can also say hey there, or you can keep it generic in case you have data quality problems and you're screaming at somebody in all caps. But regardless, choose one, stick to it. Don't change it every single time. The only part that we edit actually in this is a little rich text token. It's a short description of the asset and then kind of a quick skimmable 3 small bullet points talking about the value proposition of this specific piece. And this gives us kind of 2 ways to have a CTA, and one's contextual, this contextual hyperlink, and then one that's an actual CTA button. So in the process, and to summarize for content, basically what we do is the process for a marketing manager submitting this is we say, give us these three things: the image, the headline, the content text. We need the name of the asset, and then this piece here in the green, the thank you responsive landing page template, additional CTA after. This is one that we like to standardize as much as possible. It can't, we've gotten down to the granularity of having this defined individually per content. But ideally, it's somewhere in between you address it once a year versus it's dynamic versus it's totally changed every single time. And then once somebody fills out the form, we give them this fulfillment email. And it's kind of a breadcrumbs area of, a lot of people have different conversations and hypotheses about what's going to be most effective. Do we have the download page on a thank you actual URL here, or do we email it to someone? And what's the in between, and what's the best practice version? In my opinion, and through doing a bit of testing, that's why we have we'll email it to you, is to get people to actually provide a real email address here. We found that we kind of promise this a little bit on the landing page to encourage people to give real valid email addresses, not keyboard smash and business email section. But we also provide it on the thank you page. But regardless, even though we provide the actual URL on the thank you page, we also send an email copy. This is kind of breadcrumbs in case people want to go back in history, and it also gets them used to the idea of, we interacted, and here's what an email looks from us, and here's the first experience of an actual email to you. And so I'm going to jump in just in a second into what our actual live demo looks like and show you what the tree structure is here. So actually in Marketo, in our actual live Marketo instances, we use this for demos and kind of development here. What I'm trying to do here is basically give you at least a very quick glance at every single subsection of this. You can pause at certain parts if you want to see pieces of our demo instance. Screenshots, kind of whatever you're interested in doing here. So I'm at least going to run through this very quickly, and then I'll get into some of the thinking behind these pieces as well. So overall, the first thing that we want to address here is we have this is our content program template. You can see we have kind of a cryptic naming convention here. Last year I gave a talk about some other pieces, and I also addressed some of our naming convention and folder structure. So there will be a link associated with this as well, in case you want to go back and see some of those, see what our naming best practice document is, as well as some of our token structure that gives some explanation and color into each individual subset here. So this is our content program template. 3 subfolders that are important here: assets, campaigns, progressions. We always keep a Z development, Z, because everything in Marketo folder structure is alphabetical. So this goes down to the bottom, and we use this for things like Spot, Smart List, things like that. It's meant to be a section that can be deleted at any point in time. But specifically assets, we have landing page, thank you page, fulfillment email, the LPTYFE, and then DL is our static download list, is a canonical download list, meaning if you've ever downloaded this asset, you're going to go into this static list. So one of the more interesting pieces probably is what our token structure actually looks like. So the ones that I'm going to focus on here are going to be the local tokens. So you can take a quick glance at how these work. Mostly we use text tokens if we want to control things like the formatting of the text and want to control it elsewhere, actually within, for example, CSS or the landing page itself. If there are other things that are larger, such as the landing page text, these are actually rich text tokens. And specifically, kind of the value here is if you go into the HTML editor of these rich text tokens, is they're meant to contain basically no formatting at all. This is kind of a code purity thing. And we teach our marketing managers and people who are in marketing operations and our marketing automation persons how to do bare bones HTML, basically getting rid of individual inline styling and then standardizing on simple things such as strong for bold, paragraphs, unordered lists, and these bullet points, things like this. So we try to control all of the formatting on the CSS level so that it's not actually addressed or possibly broken in the process of editing some things here. So we have content and we have landing page. So these are the subsets for the landing page, things that are talking specifically about assets on the landing page. TY for the thank you page. So there are only these 4 tokens that drive all of the thank you page. And then we have email, body 1, copy. And I had mentioned all these things in kind of the annotated screenshot that I had shared before. But this is actually how it runs. I'm not going to jump too deep into this because, again, I'd given a talk last year, or a few years ago rather, about what drives into these individual pieces. And also we have our landing page design for available for download that you could go check out and figure out how we drive a bunch of these, especially the inherited universal and folder level kind of backup, more cryptic tokens. So to get a little bit deeper into this, I wanted to show you, so this is what our landing page actually looks like in the editor version. I mentioned it looks a little bit odd and funky in the most advanced version if we have fully tokens running everything. And this is what it is. This is a guided mode landing page, meaning it's totally responsive in Marketo's newest version of an editor for a landing page. And it looks like this, which is maybe not super intuitive if you're not familiar with how Marketo works, but it renders perfectly. And the point of this is we basically have it in tokens here, but we also have it set up in such a way so that if you need to go through and change something like the content LP form title, which I recommend you practically don't do except for once, we at least have backup tokens that can be written into the actual program. And so, for example, you can see that it doesn't exist in the actual list of tokens here, but it's kind of what I call a backup token. So this is a backup content token. So it's defined, all of the value actually comes in from the default value, which is we'll email it to you. If we ever wanted to change that, all we'd have to do is go in here and add and drag in a new text token and name it appropriately, which is content LP form title. And then it would override this value. So that allows us to put in a backup place if you want to make on-the-fly changes on the actual template level. Then after negotiating with marketing managers and figuring out what's going to be the most effective, you can make that change and then quickly modify your template without having a bajillion different versions. So this is the landing page. Everything is practically as I'd mentioned before. Probably the only nuance that's important on this piece is we have, as I said, content download universal form, and we have an external URL, which is this token. So we actually put in the content thank you URL here, and this is so that we don't actually have to go into the editor. So that means the content thank you URL is going to be right here, and kind of in the token structures. This is another thing that we found with making these program templates is in the token structure, we try to put in the default values to do some combination of different things. So we either want to make it be glaringly obvious and really, really obvious that you need to change it and you've missed something, such as like screaming edit me in the first prefix of it, or we want to do something where it's, if you miss it in the process, you can get away with a value where a prospect would be like, okay, that's maybe not the most effective thing that you could have put in that spot, but I don't think that this is broken. So for example, meta description of asset goes here. This is instructional for the person making it, so that now when I go through here and I right click clone this program, I'm just going to go into this My Tokens area and then go down from the top of these tokens. I just go literally down this list and copy and paste if I have the correct inputs from marketing managers, or I actually do it myself. So you can right click, change the URLs, and then we'll get the thank you URL, and then you can paste it into here, and that's going to affect where the landing page form redirects after you've successfully submitted the form. So that is the actual landing page example right here. I wanted to show you what this is, as we had seen in the screenshot, this is the preview version of the fulfillment email, universal fulfillment email, and this is the actual token structure of how it works. So we have all these in place. Basically, the only thing that's meant to change here is we have the button text is default value, get it now, is totally appropriate and doesn't affect conversion rate CTA URL, or rather CTA button text. If I hover over this in the bottom left, I can't point it out except for telling you, we have the my content asset URL. So that's also, we have the URL defined as a token value in itself. There's a little bit of nuance in terms of HTTP included in the link versus not included in the link and hard-coded. And you can, as I said, we'll reference where the kind of token framework is before that, you can figure out some of the nuances that are appropriate here. So this is the actual fulfillment email. And this is kind of how we structure it. So the other thing you can see, we like to put a bunch of backup options in place in the case that we want to change things, or there's kind of a funky request that's hard to actually use in our normal process, such as this email body copy 2. You can see in the preview version that this doesn't render at all because it's no default value defined, and it's not defined as an actual token on the program level. But if we do want to add another section below the normal copy and below the CTA button, all we have to do is define email body 2 _ copy, and then we'll suddenly have an entire section of new new text, new images, kind of whatever you want within the framework of this specific template. And then the final thing that I want to point out before we can move on to the next topic is going to be the structure of campaigns versus progressions. So I'm just going to quickly jump in here. So we have two triggers usually on auto response. Auto response is meant to be happened on an infinite amount of times rather. So if somebody fills out a form and they say, email it to me now, we want to send them the email with their specific asset the first time. If a year later they fill out this form and it says download it now, we should still send them a copy of that email a year later. And that's important because it defines how many times in the schedule, how many times somebody can flow through this. And a person can flow through it every single time. Because in my mind, a campaign is something that should happen every single time. It's what the campaign actually does. It's not necessarily just for tracking. It's not a one-off thing, and it's meant to be transactional. So we send this operational fulfillment email, as well as we add them to a static list. So we add them to this. This happens every single time that it happens. As you're, I'm sure, aware, if you're already in a static list, adding the flow step of add to static list is not going to actually do anything, so we're not going to run into problems in that case. Progressions here. Progressions is we're trying to figure out what the conversion rate is for a specific asset, and kind of an apples-to-apples comparison based on what the channel is. So in a content channel, we have two things that we focus on. We have visited and we have engaged. Engaged is usually fills out forms. So these are the two things we want to compare our white paper A versus white paper Z, and everything else in between. And the way that we do that is based on looking at the success in the program membership of those specific things. So here's what our actual A visited is we have visits this web page. the landing page, and then what we do is we just change their status to content visiting. And then be engaged is rather intuitively, form name is any. We use an is any and this web page constraint specifically because if you ever change the form that has to be on here, then it's not going to break this progression status and you're not going to lose any tracking value. So we say instead fills out forms any, and we care more about the actual page that somebody filled that form out on as opposed to what form they're filling out. And we change them to content engaged in here. This is how, so the kind of benefit of this structure is you have everything this program template is you have all of the assets contained right within here. So we have this collection of assets, and we have this auto response campaign, and then we have this progression. So the process of making new ones here is we actually go in, right click, clone, change the name, fill out the tokens, change the landing page and thank you page URL, and then go in and turn on these smart campaigns. We've structured them in such a way, and if you structure them exactly like this, where we're referencing local assets as opposed to, for example, so not web page is, and then you type in the URL. If you have referencing local assets, when you clone this, it will automatically change those references to be accurate. And that's really important for risks. So if you're not making as many errors, and it also means that you're going to go through this much more quickly. So the process is basically we train our marketing automation specialists to clone this program, go through here, make sure all the lights are on. It's basically what the process is. And kind of from this, we can make sure that we're addressing the things that are important to change. But this is meant to be a pretty exhaustive list of all that a person needs to edit that runs the entirety of this program. Even though we have much more backup things, we try to make sure that the amount of tokens here is as minimal as possible. So on to email templates here. So in terms of email program templates, there are two types that we talk about. We have an ad hoc email program, which is usually defined by the mailbox icon Marketo. It came out a year or two ago. And then the other kind is what I call the email cast program. So there are two major times that I use each of these, and I think each has its own important time and usage within Marketo. The mailbox icon, the ad hoc email, practically it can only be used once. It's used for one specific send to one specific audience, and it's a very intuitive user experience for the person actually within Marketo doing this. But the process basically is if you have a one-off email send, such as a product announcement, an alert, or anything similar to that, that's only going to happen once and never again, then I use the mailbox icon. If we do something that's recurring, such as for nurture, what we actually do is we have a lead nurture cast program template. So I'm going to jump into each of them, but the case for the email cast nurture program is that you can actually go in and use it consistently. And the kind of testing that you would do in that case is you'd be looking at, for nurture cast program, you'd be looking at challenge or champion testing on an ongoing basis where you're constantly trying to come up with better variations of the email. Versus an ad hoc email has really good ability to do embedded A/B testing within the program, but you're not going to see the returns consistently unless you design the experiment in a way that you're taking the learnings and applying them elsewhere. So the benefit of the email, the specific email, ad hoc email, this mailbox icon, is that the A/B test, you set it up once and then it runs. And it runs consistently, reliably. You can give it a head start so that it can actually start to calculate the audience ahead of time so that you're guaranteed to send at a certain time. Really helpful if you have a complex audience list or a very large complex database. But the structure is basically we use the exact same email, the exact same email design, email template being the HTML of the email, and we use the same tokens that drive both versions, either the one-off or the consistent nurture version. And I'm going to jump in a little bit into that. So for the token structure, you can see here on the screen, so these local tokens drive the entire content, the entirety of the individual email that goes off, either if you're talking recurring or you're talking about the individual. So this is our program here on the left. Some important pieces here is we have the individual email. We have our own kind of naming convention for the contents of the email. In this case, we have, you can see it's entitled LN space 1SNR. Really, I recommend coming up with whatever naming convention makes the most sense for your specific email designs and your way that you're thinking about them. We usually evolve into certain different kinds of things where we, for the template version, we actually go in and we come up with, for example, prefix by ETU for Etumos, and then we come up with version numbers for the specific design of the template. So we start out with ETU 1.0, and we know that that's the first version. And then if we come up with a modification but not entirely new design, we increment by a point something. So we have things like ETU 1.0 for the first design we did, ETU 1.5 for the in-between small fixes but not entire revamp. And then once we talk about new designs entirely, then we move into versioning up that. So we get ETU 2.0 and ETU 3.0 as being totally different versions, different designs, different aesthetics. And that's also a really kind of helpful hack in terms of how you're doing naming conventions on the template side, because then when you're doing looking through what's our newest design, you can just see what's the largest number, and that's the newest design that you want to use. Really helpful for onboarding, people cleaning up programs, seeing of out of the emails that are still sending, how many are in our old design. And the answer is, look at an email performance report from the last all time or last 30 days and see how many are actually going through that are current versions versus previous versions versus totally different designs and aesthetics. Maybe if you want to rebrand or something like that. And so the important thing here, so we have, I'll walk you a little bit through the naming convention. So EC for email campaign, we mean this is a one-off email. It's going to be sent once and it will never be used again. So kind of how the naming convention is evolved here. So we have YYMM, that's for the year and then the month. If you're doing individual emails on a more frequently than that, more than one or two per month, then you can get into adding days as well. But for the most part, I don't add that level of complexity and that level of granularity unless it actually serves some purpose of being able to see this came from this specific email or this month versus another one. So in our case, we say year, month, month. We put this first, so alphabetically this sorts into the year. That's the largest grouping. Email type, this, we do things like if it's a blog subscription fulfillment or if it's a launch of an individual asset that we've had for pre-order, then we do that. And then specifically the kind of shortened asset name, which is usually what the asset we're promoting, that specific email is promoting. So flow through here, the only really important piece that I've kind of identified through doing this a bit has been to make sure that the schedule is glaringly obviously wrong, as a kind of note to yourself. So 1/1/15 is not only in the past and therefore unusable, but really obviously too perfect to skim through and say that looks like a right date and accidentally do that. Through the process, you put in your individual email here. So the process would be you right click, clone this, fill in the token values right over here, body copy, CTA button text, URL, headline, preview subject line. And then this is actually what our actual email looks like. So this is the editor version of it. You can see we have an image here. This is 2x in terms of the actual size. We scale it down for Retina devices such as iPhones and newer Macintosh and everything else like that. But really, this is the entire guts of it. So we have from name, from email is really consistent. You either want to choose dynamic to the lead or dynamic to the program. In this case, we have dynamic to the lead. So this is always going to be the lead owner's first, last name, and then email address. The subject is one that's consistently changed. For more advanced versions, if you're doing things like sending from a program variable, you'd want to do things. So for example, if you're pretending to send from your CEO, and it's from CEO, your actual CEO's email address, the reply to would be wanting to be an alias that people actually monitor, so you're not overloading somebody with out of offices or things like that. Preview line is pretty important. We bake it into everything. Pretty common practice. View in browser is totally depending on what you're interested in doing. So basically, the total contents of this, if we want to make a new email, we say we need an image, needs to be 1200 by 500. That means 650 by 250, and then multiplied by 2 so we can get it down. So the request is we need an image, header image, 650 by 600 by 250 pixels, and that'll be specific to your design. We need a headline, and then we need a body copy, and then CTA button text, and the specific URL that it goes to. So what this gets down to is something that's really manageable, and especially you can notice it here from the editing piece, where this is, a really finite amount of things that you have to deal with, your marketing manager has to write, and it makes for a really smooth process of, you can go into each of these, and then, you can see we have placeholder text here in this case, but replace the placeholder text, just go through these, change these literal 6 things, and then this is the actual content of the email is ready to preview and actually get into and change. And so that ends up being kind of the token structure that we end up dealing with. It's all run by these 6 tokens run everything. There are additional things that we also, depending on how thorough you're interested in being, there are some additional ones that we do. So for example, backup text on the text-only version is an example in right here. So you can see that this is our text-only version. We have, it's meant to be 2 specific text-only text backup tokens. And these are, when you're being really thorough, with a bit of a nuance that the rich text token in the HTML version is not rendered correctly in the text backup version. And so we put in these 2 text token backups. They don't necessarily have to be anything if you have a developer audience, or if you have people who are kind of old school, have poor internet connections, or things like Blackberries. Those persons might have a higher, basically kind of likelihood to see the text-only version. We don't always bother with it. It kind of depends on how thorough we think something actually has to be, but we always put it in as a backup. So this would be something where you'd write a variation of the HTML version, but instead of having paragraphs, it'd be a text-only, 1 or 2 text-only paragraphs, and without any line spacing or formatting or anything else like that, because all the HTML is going to be destroyed on the text-only version, and it's going to kind of have some wonky formatting with it. So the backup text tokens is always something, it's one of those things that we can throw in if we need to, but don't necessarily have to in all cases. So walking through the rest of the tree for this ad hoc send, we have progressions, which is only 2 specific types. So this is kind of with the new Marketo version, our program status is member and engaged. And really, so basically what we're doing is we're relying more on Marketo's out-of-the-box reporting for these kinds of things. So instead, we're looking at email performance for this specific email, and we're also looking at smart lists to get our metrics that we're caring about, such as sent, delivered, open click, unsubscribed. These, before, we've usually included these in terms of actually progression statuses on the program, but it ends up on a large scale, very large scale. In Marketo instances, it ends up slowing things down because those can be really noisy campaigns, especially if you're looking at sent. And they can also, if you're doing Salesforce campaign syncs, these can also become really overwhelming because, really influence should be people who clicked on specifically what you're interested in, click on a specific link. So for example, all of our conversion metrics is we're looking for people who click this button. And that's what we consider the actual success and conversion on this email. And we don't really need to sync all of the people who are targeted into a Salesforce campaign that's going to sync to Salesforce, and we realistically come up with some problems. We've heard and been told things like once a Salesforce campaign reaches 10,000 plus members, then it starts to get a little bit unreliable. We've realistically seen in practice that it gets more unreliable around the 100,000 plus membership mark. But it's at least something to know where we want to be aware of it, and we want to make sure that people in Salesforce campaigns are there in that we'll see actual reporting value from them. It's not just that we're sending things over the fence and through the queue that's going to, maybe a year from now end up in backlog headache for us. So smart lists, we have sent, delivered, open, clicked, unsubscribed, and we use this for a one-off thing. So the value that we see is you can send the email and create A/B tests that automatically send winners, and that can be pretty valuable in your overall flow, so that you don't have to monitor it on a constant basis, and it's got some pretty intuitive subscription settings here. So the other version of the email program template that we usually use quite a bit more, honestly, ends up being the Nurture Cast program. So I'm not going to go through the actual tokens because the tokens are exactly identical to the one that I just mentioned. It's using the same email, it's using the same design. You can obviously use different ones if that's more to your liking, but the standard things that we find are going to be the same, such as we see it's really nice to have a large image that makes a large impactful difference, visual impactful difference in having a discrepancy between this is an old email versus a new one, and et cetera, et cetera. And then this is kind of the normal package of headline content, CTA text, as well as being careful about send times and who it's sending from. This is kind of the extent of how much you need to think and not overthink the actual email design and elements for optimizing there. So more importantly, with the email cast program is going to be things like the actual progression statuses here. So a few years ago, and we'll provide a link in here, I had gone through basically how to use this email cast program nested within an engagement program. Engagement program being the little plant icon in Marketo. We always use programs nested. We exclusively rather use programs nested within engagement programs. We don't actually have individual emails sending from the engagement program directly. The reason for this is what I'm going to talk about right now, which is the exclusion status. So the way that we find the most benefit we get is that we have an exclusion status on the actual program. The way Marketo chooses to skip an individual program in terms of the cast is based on either the prospect has received this email with that email ID, or they're already a member of that specific program. And this allows a little bit more flexibility where we can talk about the same CTAs multiple times and not worry about over communicating. Like, for example, if somebody read the buyer stage scoring blog right here, then they're already a member on the exclusion of this program, and that way Marketo will skip them. So the thing to realize here is I'm going to show you the actual inner workings, which is a bit more interesting than the ad hoc. So the only thing that we have here is a smart list, which is member of program is true and the program is any. And then we say individually send the email. This is kind of important because this is the actual mechanism. This is the smart campaign that is actually triggered by the engagement program at the time of a cast. This is actually what does the sending of the email. So we have that, and then in terms of exclusions, we have two different versions of exclusions. We have a one-off batch exclusion, which is meant to be scheduled and run once. It's kind of like for retrospective. So what we needed to do is we needed to say anyone who visited this blog page should be added to this program as an exclusion status. That's one, so you catch people in the past. And then you need something that's triggered to go on in the future right as soon as you run that batch. And that's going to be people who, at that point on and in the future, anyone who visited this specific blog post, we want to add them to the program as an exclusion status so that we're sure that they read the blog on their own time. They're not going to get an email telling them that, hey, you should read this blog because you already have. Progressions, we have sent, open, clicked, unsubscribed. There's also exclusion, and out of the box, I believe there's a targeted and kind of a converted. So the way that we think about this is we track some of these progression statuses within Marketo on the actual program, but we don't sync all of them to Salesforce campaigns. That differs a lot from how we work with other program templates, because most program templates, we want to use this button right up here, Salesforce Campaign Sync, and sync this to a new campaign in Salesforce. The problem with doing that in this one right here is that we'll probably have a large amount of people in exclusion, which is not something that Salesforce needs to see for reporting purposes. And the other thing is, for targeted and sent, these can be enormous numbers, and they don't show anything about how successful these programs are. So it kind of adds to large amounts of individual backlogs on Salesforce, and doesn't really add any clarity to anything. So on this case with these NurtureCast programs, the only campaign that we actually sync, the only campaign status that we sync is going to be for clicked or converted. And so actually in the flow here, we'd say we're going to change their program status to clicked if they click on this link right here. And then we also manually add them to a Salesforce campaign in that step as well. That way, especially when you're talking about large scale audiences, large scale databases, this kind of thing can be taken care of, where you don't have to worry about the campaign sync getting slowed down, Salesforce campaign sync getting slowed down, or number discrepancies on the large scale macro level. And the process is we take this program template, right click, clone it, go through the tokens, fill out the tokens, these guys right here, and you can see the text backup tokens right here specifically. And then set exclusions, and then this is ready to go. And how this actually looks is, this is for an example of our nurture engagement program, this little mailbox, or I'm sorry, rather plant icon here. We have your engagement program streams, usually low, medium, high engagement. You can consider that however you want, from buyer stage or scoring or anything else like that. But the actual point is, when we add in this specific program, this is the fully sent out piece here. All we have to do is drag in this smart campaign, and then now it'll be an individual piece in the cast here. And that ends up being a really scalable way to do things, and a good way to track what individual emails are performing well and which ones aren't. So list import is the next program we're talking about. And list import or list acquisition, use them kind of interchangeably. List acquisition is a good difference because a list import can be a member of an event or anything else like that. List acquisition is things like if you sponsor an event and you get a list of names that you haven't actually interacted with, or if you're doing things like Discover.org or a lot of other companies that can provide targeted lists of persons. This is a way to track that. So a lot of times I see a lot of companies make the mistake of just straight up importing this into the lead database as a bunch of lists, actually individually onto lists. But kind of through time, there doesn't seem like there's a good way to track those persons, and there's also not a good apples to apples way to compare the relative success of one source of leads versus another source of leads. And that's what this program is meant to do. This is the most straightforward program that we have. Doesn't even actually have any tokens in it. So we have a static list called LI for the list import. The channel is list acquisition. There are two program statuses, on the list and engaged. And the most important thing that I want to talk about is the discrepancy between those two. So on the list is to say if somebody is actually added to this list, we have a trigger happening here. When they're added to this list, and then we're going to change their status to list acquisition on the list for this local program. So the process is you'll right click, clone this program. You'll go in, make sure it's from the program template so it doesn't have any actual members. You're not cloning membership, which does happen. And then you'll turn on these two smart campaigns, and then we'll actually add them to this list is the part there. But the most important discrepancy I want to talk about here is being able to track the relative success of both list sources and the individual targeting of those lists and purchasing of those lists. Because a lot of time what happens, you can get, you're doing a lot of list purchasing as an example, and you can't tell what sources you should continue to buy from besides anecdotal evidence of maybe one person had kind of a positive conversation with sales. Really what we need is a conversion rate of the relative quality from list source A versus list source B, and then within list source B, subset of targeting approach 1, targeting approach 2, targeting approach 3, things like that. So what we do is we have members 1, which is all the persons who are on the list, and then what we want to do is I end up calling a success basically anyone who's on this list who has ever interacted with us in any way. And the way that we do that is by using the module of behavior score. So if you visit a web page, if you interact with an email, if you sales call, anything like that, then your behavior score is going to change. And the other thing is, if you don't do anything, then your behavior score will stay 0 or become less than 0 if you have decay scoring as well. So this is what the actual smart campaign looks like. You're looking at member of the list and your scores change for your behavior score. This is how we name it. You'd use your own, obviously. And the new score is greater than 0. And what this does, it'll just change their program status to on list and flow through once. So basically all that this does, this is a nice condensed way where you can standardize these things, and then you can see really, usually what you see list acquisition is kind of an abysmal source of leads, and this is a way to prove that over time. Not only that this is an abysmal source of leads, even though we can get them for 5 cents per, but 1 out of 2,000 actually engages with us in the absolute most minimum way, which is behavior score becoming more than 0. And so this is kind of a tool in an arsenal when you can say that this source we need to stop buying leads from this specific source because it brings us nothing. And you might see some interesting discrepancies. So even if list source A is 5 cents per and list source B is 50 cents per, you can say source A never interacts and we have an abysmal conversion rate of people who engage further, versus this other one is more expensive, but the cost per qualified lead is much cheaper and this kind of gives you the ability to have that cost per qualified lead in the process. And then finally here, this is one that it's not going to be interesting from the perspective of seeing any data in it right now, but a report that we always include in this is a lead performance report, and I'll show you what the setup is here. So we say all-time, leads created in all-time, we're going to group leads by their behavior score in values of 10, and then the smart list is going to be people who are actually members of this list. And then what this report will do is it'll show you what the actual distribution of behavior scores are for the persons in this list. And basically what we'll see is 95+% are going to have 0 behavior score. And then you might get a long tail with 1, or you might find that, the remainder of 5% of the leads might have a few other behavior scores. And that's how you can tell the difference, not just, maybe you have 2 leads who are super engaged, but the remainder get 0. Or you might see a better distribution where maybe everyone has 1 point of behavior score, between 1 and 10 points of behavior score. And then you can say, great, we need to look into behavior scoring a little bit because there might be something funky going on about, if you're sent an email, maybe maybe you're getting a behavior score increase or something like that. So for webinar is one of the more complex, larger program templates that we'll be looking at. Webinar usually has a pretty consistent cadence. We've found a lot of success with doing things like 2 invites before, 2 reminders, 1 the day before, 1 an hour before, and then a follow-up, which is a combination of attendee follow-up, no-show follow-up, and then kind of a backup option in case you just want to send 1 follow-up generically based on your knowledge of the person. So the token structure is going to be where all of kind of the meat here comes from, and I'll be hoping to walk through each of these individual pieces, kind of give you a little bit of depth on why we named certain things and what we're using and why we're doing certain approaches. We've done a bunch of these different templates for webinars, tried a bunch of different approaches, and this is kind of what we've come on to be the largest collection of the most robust as well as scalable setup for webinars, specifically in the case of doing multiple webinars per week per client. This is really where we have the most flexibility, the most backups, and in case as you run into things, you usually if you determine you need to change the target audience or you need to delay a webinar or something like that, this is kind of the most flexible option that we've come up with after many years of work. So I wanted to walk through some of the tree here on the left on the sidebar. Naming convention is pretty self-explanatory in this case. Won't get into that. But campaigns, we have, so these combination of campaigns, the way that we number things is kind of they're grouped together in logical little groupings. It's meant to be going from top to bottom, and so it's kind of meant to be intuitive in that way in interpreting what's happening. So here we have steps 1 through 6 with a few options. These are the local assets that we use. We use 2 separate invites, registration confirmation once you actually fill out the form to register, reminder 1 day before, reminder 2 hours before, or rather reminder 2, which is 1 hour before, attendee follow-up, and then no-show follow-up. The other thing that we end up doing a lot is, as everyone does, is webinars are great, but we need things to be evergreen. So what we do is we build things to be timely once, which is going to be your live webinar, and then we want to have an evergreen backup, which is we switch the landing page, which used to be live, redirected to the on-demand page. So anyone who a week later is coming back out of their out of office and missed something can actually click through links, and links still work. They'll just be directed to the on-demand version. You can use some SEO juice in that case as well. So I'm gonna probably rather quickly give you some of how this is built up, and then I'll go through the individual assets and show you how this works. So in the process of doing webinars, we basically found in doing multiple webinars per week, there gets to the point where if you give your marketing managers the ability to just write all of the copy from scratch, it's really an overwhelming amount of things that they need to do, and most of it doesn't really have that much of an impact on the actual effectiveness of getting people to register for the event and then getting the registrants to attend the event. So we've standardized a lot of things, and I'm going to kind of run through here rather quickly. So this entire webinar is powered by 43 tokens. You can see just by skimming through here some of the names. Basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to, as much as possible, dynamically create these landing pages, the thank you pages, and all of the emails as much as possible while not hindering how we're going to get the largest conversion rate of sent to registered and then correspondingly registered to actually attended. So important to look through here. So we basically have these individual tokens through here, probably about these 12-ish tokens. These are going to be specific to, as you can see, emails. These are things that are specific to emails. And then these are things that are specific to landing pages, mostly the kind of building assets on the landing pages. But as much as possible, we try to get our marketing managers who we're working with to think more in terms of and write more in terms of applicable to the entire webinar, so that we can cut their work. And so instead of taking an entire 8 hours to write the content for these webinars, instead we're trying to get it down to, you can write it in half an hour if you just sit down and power through it. And it also means the build time for us is much smaller, and the amount of errors and QA errors we create is smaller, and the corresponding QA time is much smaller. So again, we're going to have all these tokens and kind of a token glossary for download, so don't worry about jotting down everything here, but you can kind of see a little bit of how it works. Calendar ICS file, we personally use it. You can come up with something else differently. This is one of the gotchas in tokens, is that you always have to manually create this ICS, the values in here, and tokens have surprising ability to break in this case. But really everything's kind of built from this right here. So we have the bullet description, and then we have things like the webinar description, webinar on demand, and then formatting of dates and times. Things like this we've really found are the key to being able to scale your webinar efforts. And looking through these tokens real quick, we can kind of skim through and see how they end up being broken out. So we've got a big section for email. These building the email landing page here, but mostly what we're trying to do is we're trying to, as much as possible, abstract into the overall webinar information. Use this to build the majority of the assets, so that you don't have marketing managers, trying to reinvent a reminder email or an attendee follow-up email or anything like that. And we've really tried to get it down into just the nuts and bolts. What does a marketing manager actually have to do that will impact the marketing results? And then we can get the overhead and run through that while having as few errors as possible, as well as the most robust setup as possible. Kind of bake in some best practices in how we're doing this. So I'm gonna talk through of what this flow is, and then we can go into the individual smart campaigns. So basically what we need is we want 2 invites. They can be any amount of time before. They're meant to be scheduled so that the flow of this process is you'll right-click clone this, put in your token information from your marketing manager or writing it yourself, and then coincidentally, the odd numbered smart campaigns are meant to be manually scheduled. The reason for this, because you can do a lot of other things with calendar, date tokens, and then wait steps and other things like that. But really what we found is by doing this a lot, there are enough exceptions that come up where you need to do things like bump the date, or if you need to change the number of attendees and things like that, where we found that was really, in the long term, really shooting us in the foot. And so what we found is instead we'd go through these campaigns, define all the tokens, which is the majority of all the build work, and then go through and individually schedule some things. So we have 2 invites pre the event. As soon as somebody registers, change their status, and then once they're into that status, we're going to send them a reminder, the first reminder the day before, and then the second reminder an hour before. After doing a lot of different testing, this is basically, we found the best combination of things to maximize the conversion rate between registered and actually attending the conference, the webinar. So those 2 were pretty important, and we also found that we can standardize a bunch of those things. And then what we go into is the follow-up, and this is the other area where, for example, the follow-up we want to schedule out, because sometimes that can take a while for the recording to be finished. Sometimes it's just a matter of a delay from the webinar provider. Sometimes there's editing that needs to happen and compilation of slides and other things like that. So that's manually scheduled as well. And then on the evergreen front, really we want this to be around once for the timely, and then we also want it to be evergreen as much as possible. And so that's where we get into the actual on-demand landing page and the on-demand thank you page. And some other nuts and bolts that we end up seeing with here is we've got some reports that we use pretty frequently, and the other thing that we try to do is all of the targeting, as much as we're trying to do here, should be done and defined in one smart list. That's the target audience smart list. And so basically all of the targeting for this entire webinar resides within the target audience. That's our 100%, that's our entirety of the audience. And then all these other smart campaigns basically act upon subsets of that largest target audience. So when you're asking the marketing manager to find the audience, it's not create a flow of clicked here and then didn't click here and everything else like that, but it's instead define the target audience who should be targeted and sent these emails. And then the marketing operations part, the webinar template part, is going to standardize in everything else so that you don't have to worry about it, because it really has no impact on the actual effectiveness in any of these things. So I'll jump through a little bit of what these emails actually look like, and kind of walk through some of the structure here. So event 1, so there's some things that we've ended up standardizing on and are going to be consistent throughout all of these. So if I quickly flip through all of these different emails here, you can see some standard things, such as the preview line is going to be some combination of join us and then an actual date. So that'll be showing up where we have something like a subject line. This is where you can add your own flavor if you have strong opinions about subject lines and want to standardize them for your templates. But it'll basically be on, for example, an iPhone, we'll see webinar and the webinar title. And then the preview line is going to be join us on whatever X date and time. And then we get into this right here. So this is basically, we want a specific header image, and then we're going to do things like the invite text is something where we want the marketing manager to write something. This is what actually has the impact on people converting from being sent to attending, or rather from being sent to registering. And then some things that we auto build basically. So the thing that changes specifically that marketing manager is writing is this little collection of text right here. It's one rich text token right here. Everything else is, you can see, join us on webinar day, month, date, year. All these things are going to be tokenized by more granular tokens, or rather populated by more granular tokens that are going to be used throughout all of these assets in different formatting ways that will still have maximum effectiveness, but aren't going to take the extra time to do. So 3 webinar bullets are individual. This goes to the register now as the registration page URL. And then we have things like the date and time. All these things right here end up getting really standardized. If you have strong opinions about the from and reply to and everything else like that, you can play with those. I generally recommend playing and doing those tests on a template level as opposed to an individual email level. So don't do any A/B testing if you're talking about one specific invite. You're not going to use those results to modify the template on a larger level. So this is the second invite. We tried to, again, standardize this as much as possible. And you can see that this is basically entirely tokenized. So we have the old version of the email invite text, and then we add our own line, which is there's still time to upcoming register for our webinar. This is all, you can tell, very bottled right here, so that you don't have a marketing manager writing a second invite. And instead you can standardize that so it can be applicable across all webinars and not just one off where you have to spend the time every single time. So basically all of this content down here is going to be totally standardized in the process. Registration confirmation, this is an operational email, and basically you can see when you go through here, we are going to have all of this is going to be kind of marketing operational way to do it. And we even go so far as to standardizing. We found basically no additional conversion rate for people in modifying this subject line here. It's all pretty standardized. And we make this so that marketing manager doesn't have to do anything specific to this. We just bottle it all up. A reminder the day before, this is basically another operational email, and it's very similar, and it doesn't actually take any individual effort from the marketing manager to define the content in this. And then reminder 2, very similar. This is the one that's starting in 1 hour here. Just make sure to schedule that in the right time. And then we get into the actual follow-up emails. So 2 ways you usually do this. One of it is you say you have a different message for those persons who actually attended the webinar. This is pretty common practice, versus a no-show email. It's usually a sorry we missed you, or thanks for showing up. In reality, I think you can write the copy so that it works in both situations. I don't think it has any impact on the effectiveness other than don't put your foot in the mouth and say, sorry, we missed you if you attended, and don't say, we're so glad you attended if you didn't attend. So I think it's more of a copy choice, and we kind of build it either way. So these end up being all of the actual emails that build the rest of the webinar program. In terms of the actual landing page, this is what our landing page looks like. So I'm going to point out some things here. So upcoming webinar, you can see this right here is standardized. This is where the date and time is. We can have the webinar title is going to be operational and pretty standardized, used in lots of different places. Webinar subtitle, that's something that can also be used in multiple places. And it's all here, and you can see it. Forum header is something where it usually makes sense to standardize, but it depends on what your internal philosophies are. And then form fine print. This is things like if you have castle disclaimers or any kind of opt-in disclaimers, that's really useful. Or the other thing it can do is that can provide slight small increase in conversion rate if you say something that's
makes this seem more personalized and not as super standardized in this specific case, and getting people to fill out the form and actually click this button. Presenter name, this you had I had seen before on the tokens. We have this on the template level. We actually have a way that this is defined in a variable on the landing page on a number between 0 and 3. And that changes the CSS styling so that if you have 2 presenters, you go in, change that to 2, and then you only need numbers 1 and 2. Or if you have a single person presenter, change that number to 1, and then these other numbers, presenter 2 and presenter 3, end up disappearing in the process. The thank you page, thank you confirmation page for the live version is super standardized. We have an add to calendar button, and that's practically about it in terms of customization here. And like I had mentioned, this is a great way to get people to click through to the next pieces. So basically the process is we end up writing all these things out as soon as the webinar is actually done, and we've successfully sent emails, performed the webinar, and everything else like that. What we do is we go back to the individual landing page, change the URL, and then redirect it so that the live landing page instead goes to the on-demand landing page here. And this is how you get long-lasting evergreen value from doing this. On-demand here, webinar title, again, all of this is pretty standardized. But here is something, especially if you're turning it into evergreen, we have a specific to the on-demand version webinar description. And then you can see here's our actual thank you page for the on-demand. This is, again, pretty standardized out of things that are abstracted to the webinar level, not the specific content piece, not this specific thank you page. But you can do things like add an embed code right here. This is meant to be an embed code that can be any different kind of webinar provider. It can be a YouTube embed code, or it can be, anything in between, Wistia, Vidyard, specific to whatever webinar provider you're doing, everything else like that. And this ends up being the flow that we're looking at here. In terms of smart campaigns, I'm going to jump into this real quick. So again, I had mentioned target audience is the most important element here. We wanted to standardize on the target audience. We wanted it to be defined in one place and then never have to go back and change things. So you're not having enormous nested lists where you say title is XYZ, behavior score is between 10 and 1,000, and all the other exception cases. The problem with defining that in individual smart campaigns is that you have version control problems, because frequently you say either this didn't work or we don't know how many people this is going to affect, and then you end up tweaking it mid the actual sending stream, and that ends up creating huge headaches and mistargeting and over communicating and under communicating in person. So we abstract it into one smart list, and then reference that smart list throughout the rest of the smart campaigns here. The flow here, like I said, this is meant to be scheduled. So someone, as the marketing operations person, you're saying what time and date should this be sent, and then you schedule this once you create it. So we schedule this to run at a certain time, usually -2 weeks from the webinar or something like that, -2, -3 weeks from the webinar. And then this sends the email and changes people to invited. This is meant to be used with some of the out-of-the-box webinar providers that hook into Marketo, and changing people to these different stats is actually going to be communicating to the webinar provider so that links can be populated and sent out back. That'll be more applicable in a second. The second invite here, we have people who have already been invited, or people who are in the target audience. The reason is the target audience usually changes between the first and second time. Not usually, but can occasionally change, and you can define that we didn't hit enough people the first time, we need to expand the audience in order to get webinar registration up, and so that usually happens. So that's why we have this advanced filters here, 1 or 2. So either you've been invited before, and invited is important because that means invited but not on further to registered. And then furthermore, or you've been now a member of this target audience in case that audience has changed from the first time to this current time. And then the other thing that we end up doing here is saying you're not a member of the registered list. This is a static list. And this is kind of like a make sure that we're, it's a little mini redundancy to make sure that we're not over communicating or poorly communicating or putting our foot in the mouth. And all this does is it sends the actual second invite email. Now we're into the operational piece here. So if somebody fills out a forms any, again, universal forms, and we're looking at this local asset of registered. So if anybody filled out the form on that page, we want to change their status to registered in the webinar. And then we want to add them to the Salesforce campaign. We don't sync all the statuses for the same reason that we don't do it for, we don't sync all of the Marketo program statuses to Salesforce campaigns for the same reason that we didn't for email, which is sometimes the invite list is going to be 100,000 plus members, and that can create Salesforce queues, sync queues, and that can also provide some problems and ugly annoyances and angry Salesforce admins in the process. So we add them to the Salesforce campaign, usually create it in this point, and then make sure that they're at the registered point. Wait 2 minutes, and then we send the email. This is because we're waiting for, so this wait step is really important because we're changing their status to registered. This has to communicate to your webinar provider, and then the webinar provider has to populate the actual dynamic link for that person. That's why this wait's in here. 2 minutes we found is a pretty good number. It's, with the exception of somebody's service is down, that's enough time for things to populate before we send the email with your dynamic URL of click here when you actually want to sign up. Then we send this email and we add them to a static list of registered. This is, like I had mentioned before, a static list. It's a good way to keep track of things in a definitive point of time, as opposed to smart lists change dynamically depending on when you click on them and ask who qualifies for something. Reminder, this is scheduled. This is meant to be scheduled basically the day before. And from this, the whole point is that we are going to send them this email one day before, and this says tomorrow is going to be your actual event. It has a calendar link and it has your registration information. It's an operational email. Second reminder, this is an hour before. Like we said, we're looking for people to program status of registered right now, so that we caught them in the original flow when they signed up. They should be now in this status, and then we're going to send them the second reminder, which is 1 hour before. And after doing a bunch of different practice and testing and what's the combination of time and everything else to maximize the conversion rate between registered and attended, I think that's a really good, not over communicating, but still making sure that you're getting the results of people actually showing up to it. Attended live webinar. This is watching for a program status to change to attended. This will be written, especially because we're talking about webinar native integrations. This will be written by your webinar provider after it happens, and then as soon as they actually go through this, we're going to add them to a static list of attended live webinar, kind of for redundancy and for our own reporting purposes elsewhere, and also for some of our targeting elsewhere. And then what we'll do is at the end here, we'll make sure that we put that as a success in the Salesforce campaign and that they've actually successfully attended, as opposed to syncing every flow step by the native Marketo to Salesforce sync. Number 5 here, this is meant to be scheduled, batch scheduled manually on a certain time. And we're looking at people who either attended or no-showed. As in, this is people who did register, and we already know definitively if you register, there are 2 options. You either attended or you no-showed, because those are the 2 flow steps. And in this case, what we want to do is we have one send email flow, and it has 2 choices in it. We want to, well, rather 3 choices in a default. That's a little bit important. So if somebody attended, we're going to send them attendee follow-up. If somebody no-showed, they registered but did not actually attend and is tracked by the webinar provider, then we're going to send them the no-show follow-up email. And an important little nuance of how we build basically everything is planning for exceptions to happen. And in the case of an exception, maybe there's a time discrepancy, maybe there's some error that's not accounted for, or a technical glitch in the process. We can make sure if you're not attended, or no-showed, then nothing is actually going to happen to you. So you're not going to get a thanks for showing up if you accidentally got into a status or immediately flowed through to a different status, that kind of thing. Attended on demand, this is a triggered campaign. So if you fill out the form on the on-demand page, then we're going to change your status. And then the other thing that we end up doing, especially because our follow-up emails don't point people to an actual landing page for the on-demand, they just point them directly to the actual video itself. To, we have their cookie information, we get no value for them filling out another form. So that's the other way that we end up triggering the smart campaign. And if somebody attends on demand, we want to change their status to attended on demand, especially if you're doing things like having a YouTube embed video. It's no longer being captured by your webinar provider. It depends on what webinar provider you have. And then we're going to change their status in Salesforce. So we're going to do two things here. Change status, and this is a kind of redundancy thing to make sure that we're actually tracking numbers appropriately. We've seen problems where change status in Salesforce campaign only, if somebody is not a member of a Salesforce campaign and they hit a change status, we've seen it not work. They won't actually be changed status because they're not a member of that Salesforce campaign. So that's one. And then the other one is if you're not already a member of the Salesforce campaign, then we want to add you to the campaign at the appropriate status. So this will be, the status will be attended on demand on both of these options. But these are two flow steps where the redundancy isn't going to harm anything. It's only going to allow you to make sure that, or rather guarantee that you have the appropriate tracking at the end. And then we're going to add you to an attended on demand list. This is mostly for kind of way in the future. If you want the fastest processing ability is going to be member of a static list, and that's why we use this quite a bit. And it ends up being quite useful further down here. And like I said, Smart List is really the driver of all of this targeting. And so you can do things like if you're added to a static list, if you have a marketing manager giving you a CSV of persons who should be targeted, this is a good way to do it. Or you can do things like title is X, persona is X, use case is Y, and segment is this, that, and the other thing. All of those combined end up being the drivers in this case. Again, we're going to come up, there's documentation, we have a blog post that's going to be further in this actual page here, so take a look at that and you can look through here and see how it ends up being built based on that documentation. And the final program that we're going to be talking about is the event program. So an event template is an interesting thing because the whole point of templates is generally to save time and minimize errors. When you're talking about events, this is a template's really valuable when you're talking about trade shows, when you're doing an enormous amount of similar-ish individual trade shows, or similar events, road shows, things like that. Basically, it ends up being an event, and then the recommendation is to standardize based on the use case that you're using and doing multiple versions of, multiple events of, things like that. I'm going to spend less time in this because it practically takes a lot of the structure of webinars, takes a lot of philosophy of the webinar template, and tries to add a little bit more flexibility with it. Because really, when you're talking about something like your once per year event, your once per year conference, then you're talking about a total dollar investment that is relatively enormous compared to something like a one-off event. And in that case, I think it's justified and makes sense to have individual customized invites, campaigns, specifics of what's, if you have contests or swag giveaways, parties, everything else like that, makes a lot of sense for this to be as customized as possible. But I did want to show you some of the specific things that we've found to be quite valuable, and show you some of the structure of how the tokens work. So here you can see this is run by 59 tokens, runs the entirety of all these things as things are happening. Some to call out that are different or important for this kind of thing. One of which is UTM tracking. I also saw this on the webinar. You saw this on the webinar template. But for emails, especially when we're talking about multiple emails, you can see here we have something like 8 individual emails here, and they're mostly pretty templatized. We end up having one specific text string, which includes all of our URL string tagging. All of our UTM tracking comes in from this token. It's appended to all the links in all the emails, regardless of which email it is specifically. That ends up being pretty valuable in fitting into your UTM framework and making sure it's accounted in your different lead source as well. And some of the common differences that we have between events and webinars is a physical location. So we have things like actual directions and a link to Google Maps directions, or things like the pictures that you're talking about might be, prominently displaying a map, or prominently displaying photos of the actual venue, and maybe some other things layered on top of that. So it's much more custom and depending on what the venue is and other things like that. Really valuable if you're doing trade shows such as once a month, or you're doing a road show where it's the same road show except the city changes once a month. It makes a lot of sense to standardize in this case. But usually you end up having a bunch of different campaigns, especially if it's a high investment event, a bunch of different campaigns, all kind of customized. So I'm just going to run through these really quick. These are all basically the same thing as we had been talking about in the webinar event invites. Things like we have a target audience as being the most important aspect of where the targeting is coming from. So if we want to talk about the target audience, it's all in one smart list down here, this target audience. And we're editing that. And all these smart campaigns are meant to be scheduled at different times. And we've even experimented, and I think it makes sense sometimes to have an embedded embedded email cast, or rather ad hoc email, the mailbox icon within these programs, especially if you're doing lots of very different look and feels, and sometimes you have one invite and sometimes you have 7 invites, all based on different stakeholders and targeting and things like that. Generally, we have the reminders. These are, it depends. In all of the cases of these events, it really depends on what your event is. If you're talking about stop by our booth, morning of reminders is really helpful. But other things like 2 days before, if people are flying out to your event and it's 2 days before, it's probably too late to do things like that. And you need more of, what's your survival guide for the, whatever event it is, or whatever city you have as recommendations of items to do and other things like that. All of this, I'm just trying to run through this so you have the ability to look at these and pause and screenshots in these areas. But all of these are meant to be pretty customized based on the use case that you're talking about. What we do find is pretty consistent is if we're in an event and we're a sponsor of somebody else's event, as an example, consistently the thing that you have is you have a booth for follow-up. So there are lots of, as I'm sure you're aware, there are lots of different ways that you can get attendees tracked in people who actually followed up at an event, who showed up to the event, visited your actual booth, and then did, entered to win a raffle, whatever your CTA is, so that you can track how many names and qualified leads you're getting based on whatever promotion you did. But one of the things that we've found is if you're not actually kind of a platinum sponsor, then sometimes you don't have the budget, don't want to pay for, or don't have integrations with things like business cards into CSV services, or sometimes you don't have your own individual booth scanners. And one of the things that we use a lot in this case for these smaller ticket items and smaller ticket events is what we call a concierge form. The idea here is that we have an internal form in Marketo on an internal landing page such as this. And this is basically the idea is we give all of our persons who are running the booth, all of our company representatives at the booth, give them something like an iPad. We have this form, this responsive landing page on this form. And then this is a way to say like, hey, if you want to enter to win our grand prize, which is whatever the offer is that specific time, we can give them their iPad, they can fill in their own information, and then in the process, this is our way to get people actually into the system in a tracked method, and we can see the individual value of what's our performance of visiting the booth, and who's doing it, how effective it is in conversion rate, and what the follow-up is. So basically a concierge form is different from a normal Marketo form, because it's meant to be practically used just by your internal people to input leads into the system into the right status. So for example, I, Edward Unthank, I talk to somebody at our Marketo Summit booth and I say, great, we're giving away our webinar template. How about you, if you're interested in doing that, just fill out this form, and at the end of the day, we're gonna award the webinar template to whoever wins in this drawing. And so what we do is we go through, this person fills out the information, we guide them through it in person via the actual template and the actual, not template, but iPad. Input their information, they get into this, thanks, you've entered a win. Important thing to know is now that this iPad, this browser is going to be cookied as that person. And so in this case, Joe Schmo just filled out this form, we're now onto this page, the iPad is now cookied as that person. So that's both good and bad. Bad because you can rapidly, incidentally, accrue 1,000 behavior score points if you continue to navigate around your website as Joe Schmo, even though you're obviously not Joe Schmo. But the real benefit that we see in this case is this person has walked away, Joe Schmo has walked away, and I'm still holding an iPad. I'm still cookied as this person, and so what I do is we have a hidden link here. We can click on this button, which is just Etumos, and then we get into the next stage, which is notes about this person. What did we just have a conversation with about this person? Now in Marketo, I'm still cookied as Joe Schmo in this case, and so what I do is we have a field here for lead notes, the most common way to store notes about a person, and we can say Joe Schmo was really interested in our webinar event template, and we should follow up with him. He has the budget and the interest, just needs to get his manager buy-in. And then we can do things like choose a date for follow-up. If we set a date and a time in that specific time, we can say like, great, we'll perform a health audit for you and it's going to be in 2 weeks out. How about we follow up with you next week and schedule that specifically. And in the process, we can actually submit this and successfully submit all these notes about Joe Schmo. And then we just close out this window. It's all been in incognito mode. We can close out this window, and now we have in the system, we have notes about this person who just showed up. We have buy one of these smart campaigns, this visited booth. We have fills out form on the concierge form, and we have notes about this person, what they're interested, what we talked about. It's not going to be lost, and we're not going to put our foot in the mouth further, so that we can have some kind of account-based, intelligent conversations with this person after, while qualifying them on the spot as a hot or cold lead. And so, especially for events, I'd say, depending on the frequency, the idea is to save time and minimize errors. So if you're talking about one-off events or things that are high budgets for events, then those make sense to be more customized. If you're talking about doing things a lot, very frequently, once a month, twice a month, things like that kind of cadence, and then you can take this kind of version, which is our standard template for events, clone it, customize it by use case if you have a specific consistent event, and kind of lock it down that way. It's kind of a method where we start with an abstracted event template and then make child event templates that are customized by use case further. And this kind of flow is most of what you're looking for. It at least has event tracking, and you'll have all the attribution so you can see how well leads such as Joe Schmo do in terms of sales follow-up and everything else further on down the line in tracking revenue.
Thanks for staying through the 5 essential program templates that you need in Marketo. If you need any more Marketo tips and tricks, you can check out our Etumos blog. Our team has been putting together some really in-depth breakdowns on Marketo programs, templates, and the operational pieces that you need to run Marketo. If you need other templates or other resources, you can check out landing page designs available for download, 90% done, customize. Hope you found it valuable, and be sure to subscribe to our blog for future videos and future posts.